Hello and welcome to Business Reporter. Today I'm talking to Paul Clandillon, who's European leader of counter fraud at IBM. Paul, hello.
Good morning, Dan.
Let's start with a pretty straightforward question here. Are you a business expert or a technology expert?
Well, Dan, fraud is a very wide-ranging and complex subject. The risks faced by individual companies and the methods used by fraudsters to attack those companies vary widely by industry. So I'd suggest to you, to be effective in any role aimed at countering fraud, you really need to have a very good grasp of general business principles, but also detailed specific knowledge of the industry in which you're hoping to operate. However, allied to that, you also need to have an awareness and understanding of technologies, both current and emerging, that might be used to create defenses against fraud and how they might operate in practice. So you need to be a hybrid, really. Fraud is no longer just an issue for the IT department. You really need to be effective in creating anti-fraud strategies. You need to have a blend of both business and technology skills.
Global fraud seems to be increasing all the time. I mean, what is the current situation and why do we need to act now?
Well, fraud has been with us forever. And we're all very familiar with industries in which fraud has been going on for a long time. But recently there's been a step change in the character of fraud. In the past, fraud tended to be opportunistic and carried out by individuals. However, over the last number of years, we've seen the emergence of organized gangs of criminals conducting complex, collusive frauds, which are much more difficult to detect and much more costly for the ultimate victims.
That sounds like you mean cash for crash kind of things.
Cash for crash is a very good example where a group of people will organize amongst themselves to stage a car accident, with each party playing a different role, and make a claim against the insurance company, and then repeat the process with other insurance companies. And we've seen a number of these examples emerge in the UK over the last 10 years.
We hear a lot about Sony breaches and iCloud breaches. Are these real issues which we should be bothered about?
Well, first I'd like to draw a distinction here between two related disciplines. Enterprise security, which is about protecting a company from cyber attack and to prevent unauthorized access to a company's IT assets, and fraud prevention. These kind of cyber attacks are indeed very real and serious threats to companies which experience them. Companies which suffer such a public data breach can suffer catastrophic reputational damage as a consequence. If we take the example of Target, the US retail group, who were subject to an unauthorized data breach about 18 months ago, they experienced a 46% drop in consumer trust in their brand almost overnight. While cyber attacks might often be a precursor to a fraud attack, that's not always the case. There are often easier ways to get through your company's defenses. For example, by suborning an employee, or sometimes criminals will masquerade as legitimate customers.
In a phishing kind of expedition, you mean?
Well, if we take phishing as a good example, imagine you're sitting at your desk, it's 10:30, it's a Monday morning, you're drinking your cup of coffee. You receive an email. It comes from your bank. Your bank is saying they would just like to confirm your account details and your password. Without thinking about it, as you enjoy your cup of coffee, you fill the relevant details in and you press send. But the email doesn't go to your bank, it goes to a group of criminals. The criminals then use those legitimate account details to access your account and empty it of funds. No amount of enterprise security defense can protect you against that style of attack. What you need is a second layer of defense based on proactive analytics to identify the suspicious transactions as being not normal or not typical behavior for you, to block them and prevent the losses happening.
Let's talk numbers now. Can you give me some figures about the scale of fraud at the moment?
Well, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners carries out a global survey of fraud every year. And in 2014, they made the estimate that on average, companies lose about 5% of turnover across all industries to fraud. Now, if we scale that up to percentage of global GDP, you find that the estimate for fraud losses globally is $3.7 trillion.
3.7 trillion? Is that right? I mean, can you put that in some form of context?
Well, 3.7 trillion. Well, let's look at it this way. The 2012 Olympics in London cost somewhere around $13 to $14 billion to stage. If we eliminate global fraud, we could have an Olympic Games every working day of the year.
Blimey,
That's a
lot of money, isn't it? It seems to me that the forces are getting incredibly organised now. I mean, is that the case, and how are they doing it?
Well, that's a great insight, Dan, because one of the things we've noticed over the last number of years has been the emergence of an underground industry of specialist providers of fraud capabilities under the overall control of criminal gangs running the fraud scheme. Let me give you an example. In the recent case of a debit card fraud scheme perpetrated against a Middle Eastern bank who lost $47 million over the course of a weekend, we found one group of criminals had bribed an employee to gain access to credit card details. These credit card details were sold to another group of criminals who used them to manufacture counterfeit cards. The counterfeit cards, in turn, were passed to a third group who had access to a mule network who used the cards to make withdrawals from ATMs in the US over the weekend. And the cash they took out was then passed to a fourth group who used that cash to buy high-value items, easily sold, thereby returning clean cash to the overall criminal gang running the fraud.
So how can we improve our responses? What are the key things about a strong defence system?
Well, I think the first and probably primary point is to start to see that fraud is no longer a departmental or functional issue. Complex, collusive fraud takes place across departments and across channels. And so it has to be approached on an enterprise level. Older departmental-based approaches are doomed to failure. Fraud needs to be elevated within our companies to the board level, and ownership of the problem needs to reside at the board level. Secondly, we need to expand the observation space that we're using. In the past, when we were looking for potentially suspicious transactions, we tended to just look at the details of the transaction themselves. And this has often resulted in large numbers of false positives flooding the system. Instead, if we combine this with open source intelligence from the internet, we can make much better predictions at much higher confidence levels. Consider, for example, we have a potentially suspicious transaction committed by Paul Clandillon. And then we do a search on the web and we identify that Paul Clandillon has previously been convicted of a fraud against another company. Now we have context in which to make a much smarter, much more intelligent decision. And the last thing we need to do is to adopt an agile approach to the fraudsters. As we identify new fraud vectors and block them off, the criminals create further generations of attack methodologies. Many companies today are creating financial intelligence units whose task is to mine historical data to identify patterns that our systems didn't pick up and to adapt those systems to respond to those patterns. We can also make use of new intelligence sources, for example, IBM's Red Cell capability, which seek to catalogue types of fraud as they emerge and to inform our clients of those new fraud typologies before they become victims.
So more generally, how can IBM help take on these fraudsters?
IT vendors in the past have tended to approach this as a point problem, providing point solutions to line of business issues. IBM's perspective is fundamentally different. We believe this needs to be treated as an end-to-end problem. We need to attack it with the latest available technologies, however, all based on a single integrated platform. Where in the past we've used capabilities like rules, for example, in the insurance industry, if somebody has made 3 claims in a year, we might treat that as suspicious, for example. These rule bases have often tended to throw lots and lots of false positives, negating our efforts to actually find the real frauds. IBM's approach is really quite different. We want to take the latest analytic capabilities, such as behavioral analytics, predictive analytics, and the newest capability, entity analytics, to find non-obvious relationships between parties and hence networks. And we want to be able to pass this information to a fraud examiner when they're conducting an investigation, so that that fraud examiner can use that output to construct on a screen a visual representation of the fraud network in real time. And that way they can identify who are the parties playing a role in these frauds and who's at the centre of the nexus of the fraud.
So it's a huge amount to deal with in that. Looking forward, what are the major challenges you see over the next 5 years or so?
Well, I believe the biggest challenge we face today is a lack of awareness of the scale of the problem. Over 2/3 of companies make no attempt to use proactive analytic techniques to detect fraud as it's conducted transactionally on a day-to-day basis. Very few companies have really accepted the premise that fraud is enterprise in scale at this point, and are still using point technologies which are ineffective and doomed to failure against complex network fraud. Other techniques that we know are effective, proactively examining transactions we know means fraud schemes are identified twice as quickly, and fraud losses are 60% less. There are other techniques, organizational capabilities which can be used as well, but overall the biggest issue is awareness. However, there is the emergence of new technologies does give us some cause for hope. Companies which are prepared to create enterprise anti-fraud units, equip them with the latest and best available technologies, and make full use of the opportunities presented by big data and open source intelligence on the internet, do stand a chance of combating and scaling back the fraud losses we've seen to date.
It's very interesting. I've learned a lot about fraud, a fascinating insight. Thank you very much, Paul.
You're very welcome, Tim.